Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our co-host, we have our analyst, really a man in the middle of so many victory laps. It's almost hard to keep track of them all. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing tonight?
Doing great. Holy crap. 2019 is take season. Holy crap. All my takes. They're almost all coming true. Carson Wentz looked bad, which is great, even though they won. So, the Packers lose, right? Aaron Rodgers still doesn't have it, even though he had some pretty good throws. Great for my takes. Fantastic. Throws a game-sealing interception in the final 2 minutes. You will say, hey, maybe that's not his fault, but he did have a dropped pick six, so we'll count it. Yeah, fantastic.
And
Went for like 160 yards, and people are like, wow, the elite quarterback is back. And it's like, all right, let's go.
And the Packers defense, the Packers run defense specifically, is complete trash. Despite the fact, complete trash. A team that hadn't been able to run all year ran all over them. It was wonderful to see. Just fantastic. Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Dusty is on assignment. He's been gone the last couple of weeks, and I just want to quickly address it. He hasn't been replaced or kicked out or anything. He's in the middle of opening a restaurant, or he's currently opening a restaurant in the Denver area. And as it turns out, the hours are much more difficult to podcast around than had originally been expected. So he will be back, and will be back soon. He just apparently doesn't want to live past 40. So he's going to keep opening restaurants until the day he dies, apparently.
Which is fairly soon.
He's just going to keep going. His poor teeth. So Dusty will be back, I promise. But we will be doing a couple of things here today. We will be talking about the upcoming Bears game with Lorin Cox, owner of the greatest Twitter handle in all of Twitter, Cox Sports One. He will be on to talk about the Bears game with Arif, and also we will be going over the mailbag as well. So, but before we start, just want to thank you guys so much for listening, for sharing the show on social media, on Reddit, wherever you tell people. I actually just ran into a coworker the other day who was like, do you have a podcast outside of work? Because I just noticed your handle on Twitter with Arif and I was confused. It's like, yes, people are often asking me. It feels like the Tyler Durden thing. Like, people always ask me if I know Arif Hassan. But yeah, please share the news. Please share the podcast. We really do appreciate it. If you hear value in what we produce, you can also donate to the show. You can do that in one of two different ways. You can go to paypal.me/NorseCode, and you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode as well. And as mentioned last episode, if you donate to the show in $3.50 or more per month over at Patreon, you can receive free swag. We have a whole mess of swag from the New York show. We still have a couple things, I believe, from London, and then a few random things along the way. I believe I still have at least one Kyle Sloter Vikings card. I believe I might have a Josh Freeman card in a Vikings uniform as well.
You do such a great job selling the swag for the show. It's like we bought some bumper stickers once, and we've accumulated random stuff. We're like, hey, we'll give it away.
Exactly.
Guys, come on. So leftover bumper stickers from the London show that none of you were able to make it to because it's in another country. Some free shirts someone gave us. We're going to have to take an extra. We just lost one of them, so we're going to take one of those back. And then get some cards that no one wants.
No, it's hey.
Please donate to the show.
People may be interested in the Josh Freeman one. That's rare because it's not like he was.
It is rare.
He was not a Viking for a while. I remember when I found those and I sent it to both you and Dusty, and the response was "Mother of God." And people must be interested in it because we have two new Patreon subscribers this week to thank. Casey via Patreon. Again, thank you, Casey, so much. And Noah, who sends this message: I love the show and enjoy hearing whatever optimism is in you, and hearing that be crushed by the crushing reality of being a Vikings fan. Keep up the good work, and please take my money. Thank you, Noah. And yes, we will be crushed indeed. So again, if you enjoy the show and would like a little bit of free swag, go to patreon.com/norsecode and $3.50 or more per month, and you get some free swag from us. We're just waiting for the cards to be charged at the end of the month, and you will be sent in. And we'll just be doing this during the months during September, October, and into November as well. So basically, if you donate to the show this year, you're probably getting some swag. Also, we had our live show announcement last episode, but just wanted to reiterate that to everybody that November 29th, we will be taping a special live edition of Norse Code from Pedosky's in Seattle, Washington. Again, Pedosky's in Seattle, Washington on November 29th. So if you are in the Pacific Northwest, please come on out. We will be doing the taping. Not sure on the time yet, but we will have more information as we get closer to the date. So again, Pedosky's, November 29th. Now, let's go into the interview with Lorin Cox that Arif conducted earlier today.
All right, yeah, I've got Lorin Cox of Bears Wire, Pro Football Focus. Did I get that right? I just kind of assumed that that's where you were right now.
Yeah, just, it's a long list sometimes in the Twitter bio, so pick a couple of your favorites and roll with that.
Cool. Well, I just picked them, so we'll roll with that. Twitter handle @CoxSports1. Again, best Twitter handle in the business. Frequent guest on the show, especially when we talk about the Bears, primarily when we talk about the Bears. How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing well. Looking forward to a couple of teams going into week 4 here that are in kind of weird spaces, respectively.
Yeah, well, who?
Well, I feel like both the Vikings and the Bears are kind of feeling like what's going on with their quarterback situations and how far can their defense carry them and what's going to be going on in this game. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it shapes out.
Cool. Well, let's talk about the defense first because that's kind of the mover for the Bears right now. Before we talk about any of these individual players, all of whom seem to be very talented, let's talk about kind of what the differences have been now that we're 3 games in between Fangio and Pagano, because I think one of the first differences people expected was that the Bears would blitz more often, and I don't think that's happening.
It wasn't through the first 2 weeks, but they did change that on Monday against Washington. So, first 2 games, it was like a slight increase from, statistical measurements of blitzing from Pagano to Fangio, but not a drastic change. But then we saw him really kind of come out and throw some heat at Case Keenum last week. And I'm imagining that's probably sort of the strategy. It's not going to be a blanket, let's blitz more idea, but it's going to be a game plan to game plan, team to team, and perhaps just a little bit more so than we had seen from Fangio, where Fangio would bring the blitz at times against some opponents, but I just think it's all just heightened and accentuated a little bit more under Chuck Pagano from a blitzing standpoint. It's not going crazy with, totally, empty in the house and just leaving a couple guys back in coverage, but just, little things with, a 5-man rush here and a safety coming there. But overall, yeah, you're right that it hasn't been drastically different.
All right. Well, I find that kind of interesting just because that was the kind of not narrative, but the expectation going in.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was something that Bears fans could kind of point to say, okay, how can things be maybe better with Chuck Pagano than Vic Fangio? And maybe that's partially a defense mechanism from losing the coordinator that ran the number 1 defense in the NFL. But, it's those kind of things of like, okay, now that the Bears are kind of starting with not new. I mean, you want to kind of maintain the same things as Fangio, but at least what kind of changes could they make under Pagano? And that was the one that we were looking towards. But it doesn't necessarily mean that one way is better than the other, right? I mean, more blitzing does not mean better defense necessarily. It's just a matter of making sure your pass rush is effective and you have enough coverage on the back end and trying to sort of balance when and where to use those. And so far, Pagano hasn't really needed to change things up all that much.
All right, fair enough. Well, so what do you point to as the reason there hasn't been a ton of defensive regression? Because that was the big talking point, I think, for the Bears, at least in our circles, that there would be a lot of defensive regression. Regression is fairly typical for top-level defenses. The teams that tend to be immune to it tend to keep their defensive coordinators. That's not true for the Bears. Is it because of a lack of roster turnover? Is it that Pagano is just a much more talented defensive coordinator than we typically see with defensive turnover rotation? What's the deal?
Well, I think it is a little bit early, right? I mean, I think from a season-long trend standpoint, we're not totally sure that after 16 games, the Bears are necessarily going to be exactly where they are right now. But like from a sample standpoint, they played a Packers offense that is still kind of finding their way under Matt LaFleur, and Aaron Rodgers hasn't really had his dominance for more than a little bit of that Vikings game. And then they played Joe Flacco in Denver and Case Keenum in Washington. So they haven't had they haven't gone up against an offense that has really done a lot to challenge them and then really pressed them in a lot of different ways. And some of that was to give them some credit for being able to play really well against poor offenses. But eventually you wonder if as the season goes on, they play Kansas City in Week 16, for example, and Daniel Jones and the Giants are going to give them a run for their money. No, but so I think at times. There might be times when this defense has more opportunities to be a little bit worse. They're still a very, very good defense, but they're not the number one defense in the NFL right now. I mean, I think they're in that top 5 still, and I think that's sort of where expectations should be. So in some sense, they have stepped back a little bit there. And through the first 2 games, they had 1 turnover. And last week they got 5 against Case Keenum, and that sort of was the area of regression most people were expecting. The turnovers is so hard to maintain from year to year. And to start the season, it looked like they weren't going to maintain that at their previous pace, but Washington just kept giving them the ball over and over again, and now we're sort of back in that area.
Top defense in the league right now, Patriots, right?
I think so, because they play the Jets and the Dolphins.
Right. All right, then let's talk about some of the coverage changes. One of the most interesting ways that I think defenses can change from year to year is how they change the deployment of their safeties, whether or not they move into man coverage, zone coverage, match coverage more often, whether or not they like to disguise what their coverages are doing pre-snap and stuff like that. Have you noticed any changes from what Fangio likes to do? We know he likes to do a little bit of cover 6, which is not all that uncommon around the league anyway. We know that there's a fair bit of zone coverage with what Fangio does, which is kind of helping drive the turnover stuff. Have we seen some of the same stuff with Chuck Pagano?
It's been similar, but some changes, kind of subtle, like the blitzing thing. It's not drastic, but you can when you kind of sit down and compare the two, you can kind of pull out little things. Like some of it's not even specific to Pagano, but just when you replace Adrian Amos at safety with Clinton Dix, that's 2 very different styles of safeties playing the same spot in the Bears starting lineup. So as a result, we have seen a lot more. I don't know if a lot more, but noticeably more 2 deep coverages from the Bears. They'll still bring Clinton Dix and Eddie Jackson down in the box plenty. I mean, we're not talking 75% 2 deep coverages or anything like that, but just more so than we saw last year. I mean, the Bears could really get away with, a lot of times they would be rolling in one way or the other, would start with 2 deep safeties and kind of roll down and do different things to sort of make it look different for the quarterback. But the Bears were a majority single deep safety team last season, as are a lot of teams in the NFL, but a lot of cover 1, a lot of cover 3, and then the cover 6 kind of mixed in there to throw defenses off a little bit. And with Pagano, we're still seeing a lot of single deep coverages, don't get me wrong, but more 2-man, more true cover 2, more true cover 4. And then again, it's not that those are now huge parts of the offense, but I do think, or of the defense, but I do think there's a little bit more variety in that regard. And some of it, I think, is they just don't want to have to take Eddie Jackson out of the deep areas of the field. They don't want to have to take Clinton Dix out of the deep areas of the field. And if they can stop the run with 6 or 7 in the box, which they've been able to do pretty successfully so far, they're going to do so. And then they're going to let their safeties kind of roam deep and see what kind of turnovers they can generate on the back end.
Against a fairly run-heavy offense, plus an offense that tends to go heavy, additional tight ends, additional running backs like the Vikings, do you expect to see them kind of roll down, maybe move away from cover 2, at least on early downs?
Yeah, I would expect them to kind of feel it out as the game goes on, right? I don't for example, Chuck Pagano hasn't been afraid of base defense the way some coordinators have. I think there have been times when a defense might try and stretch them out a little bit in one way or another, and the Bears still being, comfortable trying to keep some base players in there. I mean, not that they would, keep 4 linebackers in against 4 wide receivers or anything like that, but I do think there are times when if a team's going to come out with, some of these sort of hybrid tight end players that maybe you want to cover with a defensive back versus a linebacker, we've still seen a decent amount of base defense in those looks, and doing some different looks off of that. And when you do get into some sub personnels, different dime packages and getting 3 safeties in sometimes and trying to throw some different things around there. But I would expect some base defense. I would expect a little bit more safety in the box against a team like the Vikings. And then kind of as the game goes on, if Dalvin Cook's able to get rolling pretty well, I think that's the kind of thing where they want to then make sure they're keeping a lot of safeties and numbers in the box. But if they can start getting some penetration in their front 7, maybe you start to see them roll out of it a little bit and disguise it a little bit more rather than kind of saying, hey, we're in the box, we're stopping the run.
All right, let's talk about some of the individual players. The top defensive player in the league is obviously Aaron Donald. Where does Khalil Mack rank among all defensive players at any position?
He's definitely in that top 5, and it's so hard for me. I mean, I'm with you 100% that Aaron Donald is number 1. And then once you get after number 1 there, it's so hard for me to like nitpick between, Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa has been playing so well. And even like Shaq Barrett's been the best pass rusher in the NFL this season. So all of a sudden he gets thrown in there. So, I mean, Khalil Mack does everything well. I mean, maybe not coverage, but he's just not asked to do that very much and shouldn't be asked to do that very much, but so great as a pass rusher, so smart in run defense and really physical, aggressive, and just you rely on him every single play. So, I mean, you can't say too much about how good Khalil Mack has been and continues to be. And I think he's going to be looking forward to a nice matchup in Minnesota on Sunday.
A nice matchup. That's putting it generously. Riley Reiff has played like an average tackle thus far this season. That's where I believe his career average is as an average offensive tackle. What can a team going up against Khalil Mack do when they've got an average tackle? It's not a below average tackle. It's not like a fire alarm scenario, but it's also, you can't just like say, hey, Joe Thomas, we trust you, right? Like what are teams doing to try and prevent? And I know Khalil Mack is like, I think tied for second or third in total pressure. So there's not a lot that they've been doing that's been successful. What have they been doing to kind of slow him down? And what has been the closest to successful?
Well, he'll probably end up playing more against Brian O'Neill on the opposite side, which is probably, from what I've seen, a good thing, for Minnesota. And the Bears will move Mack around here and there, and they'll move Leonard Floyd around, and sometimes put him on the same side and do different things that way. But teams just put a lot of bodies on Khalil Mack. It's of course tight ends taking very long chips before they release in their route, or even just staying in to pass block. Of course, it's running backs coming over and helping, and sometimes it's sliding the protection that way and just having both the right guard and right tackle go over and take care of Khalil Mack. I mean, from a man standpoint, sometimes it's just about bodies, but then, other times teams will go to try and just get rid of the pass quickly and just try and neutralize the pass rush that way. That was Denver's game plan. To some extent, that was some of Green Bay's game plan, but the Bears pass rush eventually kind of made them hold on to the football, and they were able to get there eventually. So there's not a foolproof strategy, but tempo and quick passing and sort of getting the defense tired has proven in the last couple of years to be one of the main ways to slow them down.
So that kind of approach, especially the beginning one that you described involving, maybe bringing a right guard over, maybe having a running back help out, that prevents the running back from helping out on the interior. If you're bringing the right guard over, that means that you've got some opportunities in the interior to rush the passer. But, normally, you'd be pretty scared because Akeem Hicks, one of the more underrated defensive tackles in the league, would then get one-on-one passing opportunities. But he seems to be hurt. We don't know if he's going to play for this game. I haven't seen, as we're recording, the Thursday injury report's not out yet because we're recording Thursday morning. But that likely means Roy Robertson-Harris, I think, at defensive tackle, next to Eddie Goldman on base downs. And then I have no idea what nickel rush looks like. So what are the opportunities there? Do you think someone like Roy Robertson-Harris, who I believe might have been a PFF Secret Superstar last year, don't remember, what are the opportunities that are available for the Bears? What's the kind of drop-off to expect if Akeem Hicks is injured? And if he's not injured, what kind of disaster could a right guard, right tackle double on Khalil Mack do?
Well, for the most part, the attention that Khalil Mack receives, hasn't been like a direct path for, Akeem Hicks or it's not like any one player necessarily automatically gets a big bump when defenses have to start really addressing Khalil Mack. You end up getting more one-on-one matchups, but the the benefits kind of tend to be spread where, like in any pass rush, when you have some one-on-ones, somebody's going to win here and there and you're able to sort of take them where you get them, but it's not always the same guy dominating. So I think it will be spread out a little bit there. And if Akeem Hicks can't go, it may even be more noticeable in the running game rather than the passing game. I mean, Hicks is a great interior pass rusher, but he's even better against the run. And it really is the strong area for him. And it's obviously a concern when you're talking about a Dalvin Cook-led Vikings offense that can do so much. At this point, we're not really sure what to expect from Hicks. He left last week with the knee injury and was ruled out in the game, which usually tells you that there's a little bit more there than just a minor nick. And he didn't participate on Wednesday, but that's sort of to be expected for the first practice. So we'll kind of see how he plays out. But then one of their other starters, Bilal Nichols on the defensive line, he broke his hand a couple weeks ago and he will likely be out for this game again. So they're sitting pretty darn thin on the defensive line. It's going to be Roy Robertson Harris in the starting lineup. And then if Akeem Hicks can't go also, then it'll be a combination of Nick Williams and Anderson Abdullah, two guys who you've never heard of and don't need to have heard of because they mostly come off the street and have been undrafted free agents. They do a fine job. I mean, they fill space on the defensive line, but they're not penetrating. They're not making plays in the backfield. So the Bears are really keeping a close eye on their defensive line depth. Even Eddie Goldman was on the injury report last week when he was dealing with a hip or some kind of little minor things here and there. So, I would expect Roy Robertson Harris to be the other name to keep an eye on there. He had a little bit of a breakout performance to start the season in Green Bay with 2 sacks, 1 hit, and 2 hurries. And I don't know that he was on the PFF secret superstar list, but he has been a popular breakout candidate of choice for this Bears defense. So he hasn't put it together for a bunch of consecutive strong performances, but a great athlete, a converted outside linebacker, one of those kind of freak guys that could play gunner on special teams early in his career, the Cornelius Washingtons of the world. And I think people are looking for him if Akeem Hicks is going to be out again and Bilal Nichols is out again. It's on Roy Robertson Harris, but I think the bigger impact, like I said, may be in run defense than pass rushing.
I think Leonard Floyd is overrated. Am I wrong?
Depends on who you ask. Because some people have, I've seen the whole gamut of rating of Leonard Floyd. I'm with you though. I mean, I think, because it's tough because going into the season, I think he was properly rated, that people were like, well, he still hasn't had a very successful season with a lot of sacks. But then early on this year, we're starting to see him get to the quarterback a little bit more. He had 2, I believe, both in week 1 against the Green Bay Packers. And it was like, all right, here we go. But then 2 weeks later, haven't seen much more. And he's playing a lot better in the non-pass rushing ways, which is not nothing, but also not what he was drafted in the top 10 for, not what the Bears traded up for him for. So he's been better in coverage, a lot better in run defense, being aggressive on some of those blocks and not being just the fast, skinny, weak guy, but actually showing some strength and using his, using proper technique to get his core and really, his lower body to drive some of that strength from his length. But as a pass rusher, we're still not seeing him consistently win one-on-one pass rushes. Both of his sacks against Aaron Rodgers in week 1 were sort of plays where he just sort of held his pass rushing lane and did his job in that regard and let Khalil Mack and Akeem Hicks and Roy Robertson Harris flush the quarterback to him, and then he just disengages and wraps up. And those are sacks. Those count just as much as any other sack. And he was in the right place at the right time. And I think that's the best way to describe Leonard Floyd right now. He is very good at being in the right place at the right time. And that helps. That helps in run defense a lot. That can help a lot in pass rush. But he's not a dominant edge rusher who can consistently beat the blocker across from him.
I'm most worried about, aside from Khalil Mack, I'm most worried about the Garrett Bradbury and Pat Elflein matchup against Eddie Goldman. Eddie Goldman, obviously a nose tackle. We're not going to see him on every down, but he does play a fair amount, and he was a phenomenal run defender, a decent pass rusher last year. Seems like he's doing a little bit more as a pass rusher this year. Is that something that is variance? Is that something Vikings fans should be worried about? What about that matchup can you tell us?
Well, it definitely is going to play the biggest in run defense, like you said. And I think that's still Eddie Goldman's bread and butter. And he's not necessarily the the one who makes the big penetration and gets in the backfield. And I don't know that you get that a ton from any nose tackle, but it's like Akeem Hicks is always the one who's like knifing through and winning right at the snap and getting through there. But Goldman is the one who you double team him and he's just not going anywhere, or maybe he will split it and at least redirect the running back near the line of scrimmage. I mean, he's just smart, strong, knows how to use his hands and his feet and to not really get out of position hardly ever at all. I mean, no one's perfect on the defensive line, but I mean, he is just underrated in his consistency more than anything. It's not the big tackle for loss numbers. It's not, it's not any of that. It's just sort of winning your gap, winning your block, and making the tackle for a short gain, which doesn't really get recorded all that well in terms of statistics. So I would expect that to be a fairly favorable matchup from the Bears in a run defense standpoint. And Goldman, he's a fine pass rusher for a nose tackle, but the key thing there is for a nose tackle, he's not going to dominate this game and get 2 sacks or 3. You know what I mean? Like if he's getting a couple sacks, it's because the quarterback steps up into the pocket in his arms. So I wouldn't expect. I mean, he can get some pressure. I mean, right? He is not a useless pass rusher, and I'm not trying to belittle his pass rushing ability, but just in the context of him, he is a nose tackle. He's a good pass rushing nose tackle, which is probably overall a below average pass rushing defensive lineman.
This will be interesting then, because from a pass rush perspective, we'll have the movable object against the resistible force with Bradbury, who I believe has the lowest pass blocking grade among all centers in PFF, and Eddie Goldman, who has some pressures.
So, see, I would expect it to be not so much just Goldman beating Bradbury one-on-one, but it's Chuck Pagano stunting in different players. It's Khalil Mack looping inside, it's Leonard Floyd looping inside, and Goldman will be more of the distraction and the body occupier to try and take Bradbury's attention while somebody else loops around and gets the quarterback.
Late career Justin Smith. Well, okay, let's talk about the linebackers. So I keep hearing that the Bears linebackers are underrated. I was a huge fan of Roquan Smith coming out. The best comparison I saw for him as a draft prospect was Eric Kendricks. I think he's got the capability to surpass Kendricks, even though Kendricks is having what seems to be a career year early in the season. But PFF hates these linebackers. 48 grade for Smith, 56.2 for Trevathan. Obviously, early in the season, small sample. Trevathan, by my eyes, quick glance broadcast viewing, had a pretty good game last week, but maybe, I'm missing something in coverage or there were some missed tackles I didn't account for. I don't know. What's the truth about these Bears linebackers?
Yeah, the problem with, first of all, the linebacker position in Chicago, everybody loves to love the linebacker position. And so everyone looks at the tackle numbers, and you've seen some pretty big ones from Trevathan and Roquan Smith.
We both got thoughts on tackle numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, and just because he was around the ball a lot doesn't mean he was around the ball for good reasons, right? I mean, both of those guys have been targeted quite a bit, given up a lot in coverage, and both have missed some tackles. And with Roquan, missed tackles is a bigger issue than it is for Trevathan. It was an issue last season, and he does a good job of being around the ball, and you got to give him some credit for that and using that speed to be able to roam around. But at times he'll overrun it and take a poor angle, and just little things like that, and has been, a target literally for opposing quarterbacks. And not that he's been terrible, in coverage, but it's just sort of, he is put in difficult situations because good offensive coordinators put linebackers in difficult matchups in coverage and, take advantage. So, it's not that he's just been terrible, but he just hasn't been very good, and he's been in the spotlight a lot, and he's been a work in progress, and at times you'll see some great instincts, and the pieces are still all there, right? But it's sort of a patience thing with him, and it has been a small sample size so far, and I think we'll see him continue to kind of get more and more comfortable as the year goes on. So I think right now Trevathan is still the much better linebacker in that regard. I know his PFF grade hasn't been as high either, but certainly higher than where Roquan Smith has been this far. And some of that for Trevathan, again, has been coverage related as well. He's been maybe even a little bit more vulnerable just because he's a little bit less fluid of an athlete. But it seems like it's a bit more just game plan oriented because teams aren't trying to throw too much deep against these Bears safeties, and especially with this Bears pass rush. So what does that mean? It's a lot of checkdowns and quick passes over the middle, which tend to be in the coverage areas of these linebackers, and you can kind of dink and dunk and take your yards here and there. And the linebackers have to be able to step up and play tighter on that, but they can't give too much space to a running back who might be able to outrun them in the open field. So there's just some of that difficult balance of putting these linebackers in difficult spots that they haven't always been able to properly address.
Dalvin Cook, pretty good receiving back. Diggs and Thielen, great receivers. Maybe not great, capital G, but great receivers. Yeah. And so that creates an interesting question about what the best matchup is for the Vikings in terms of the passing game. Is it a pretty good above average receiving back against these linebackers that have been struggling a little bit in coverage? Or is it a more talented group of wide receivers who actually, they haven't been having the best year thus far, but a more talented group of wide receivers up against what strike me as a more talented group of cornerbacks, plus they've got that safety help. What matchup do you think presents the most opportunities for the Vikings? What are the biggest risks of those matchups?
Definitely CJ Ham out of the backfield.
We'll see that. We'll see a little bit.
Put him in the Kyle Juszczyk role. Let him eat. Right? No, yeah, I do think there's going to be opportunities for Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. I mean, not that. Like you said, the Bears cornerbacks have been very talented and are very talented and have had some pretty strong performances, but it still feels like it mixed in between the great performances. There have been plays here and there where there's some space for players to operate. A couple of big plays against Prince Amukamara so far this season, and Kyle Fuller's a guy who will give you a lot of space at the line of scrimmage, and if you can kind of work him on that for a full 4 quarters and start taking some of that space, start getting him to creep up a little bit more and bite on some of those underneath throws. At times last year, you could hit him with the double move and have that space downfield. And so I mean, there's some vulnerability here from the cornerbacks. And I don't know, it's sort of something you have to work at over the course of the game. So whether that means I don't know that makes it the best matchup, but I think there is some room there that eventually you can kind of break free if you keep kind of going after these cornerbacks. And I think that can be ultimately the difference in this game. But as you're sort of trying to work that and break that, I think it's the running back out of the backfield. It's Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith Jr. kind of doing their work, crossers like that with a running back out of the backfield and just it's not necessarily that you as the Vikings are isolating, we're going to get the ball to Dalvin Cook, but it's okay. We're going to have Cook coming out of the backfield. We're going to have Rudolph going one way, and you're going to have, a slot receiver going the other way. And that linebacker has to pick one of the three. And it's not about the receiver that you're trying to match him up with as it is the situation you're putting that linebacker in to have to make a decision. And then you throw the ball where he doesn't go.
That's fair. And plus, there's no Jair Alexander among these corners. They're talented, but they're not as talented as some of the corners the Vikings have already played against. So I find that kind of the cornerback situation interesting. You already mentioned ways to neutralize the pass rush include quick passes. They might also include screen passes. That puts an emphasis on cornerback tackling. No one is Trey Waynes when it comes to cornerback tackling, but I do have some questions about how capable these cornerbacks are at stopping the quick game with their tackling.
Prince Amukamara has been a solid tackler as long as he's been in Chicago. And Kyle Fuller used to struggle with that a lot more. And I think over the last couple years, he's become a lot better at wrapping up, and especially this season, I think, really stepping up and getting physical with receivers. But the person who has struggled the most with tackling in this Bears secondary is actually Eddie Jackson. I mean, that has been his big flaw. I mean, he's got 6 missed tackles through 2 games, and he's on pace to far eclipse. I think last year he missed 9 or 10, and he's already got 6 so far. So that's been an issue. Buster Skrine has been missing some tackles as well. And somehow, some way, Clinton Dix has been one of the team's most consistent tacklers this year in the upset of the century.
Well, we'll see if that continues. All right, so we talked a lot about the Bears defense. We're on a bit of a time crunch, so let's move around to the offense. We have to talk about Mitch Trubisky for the brand. We'll talk a little bit about the throwing left thing, but more importantly, he's somebody that, a lot of people I think overstated his case as a second-year breakout player, or at least a guy who's improved. But I've always been down on him. I didn't think he was a good pick. I don't think he's played well. But despite all of that, he has disappointed me. I think he's played below my level of expectation that I have expected. I've compared him to Christian Ponder. He seems to not like to push the ball downfield. He seems to be kind of a short passer. Even though he's a short passer, he seems kind of inaccurate. He does have some moves with his legs. What's the deal here, man? I thought he'd be better.
Yeah, everybody did, right? I mean, that was all the talk all off season was, year 2 in Matt Nagy's offense, year 3 in the NFL. He's got, Matt Nagy said last year we're on offense 101 and this year we're on 202 and all this stuff about how he's commanding the huddle and he's got all this confidence and he's firing. And then, yeah, not coming out that way. And this is obviously the magic question, right? We don't have the exact answer from outside of the organization of what is exactly going on, but clearly the quarterback that started week 1 and we've seen through 3 weeks even looks worse than the guy who finished last season. Like there were games at the end of last year and like even the last drive against Philadelphia where there were it was like he was starting to string together some of these better plays and more accurate throwing downfield and really like, oh, he's on the cusp of something. And then we come back this year and we're kind of back a few steps from where we finished last season. So it feels like it's sort of this delicate back and forth of how much the Bears offense wants to allow him to do versus trying to force him to just take some of the quick throws and get some rhythm there. But then it's also like holding him back from being able to throw more downfield and do more explosive plays and have a more dynamic offense. But at the same time, sometimes when they let him do that, you see either interceptions or dropped interceptions and inaccurate and forced throws downfield when he just tries to do too much, tries to play a lot of that hero ball, as Matt Waldman would say, and just, put the ball in harm's way. So it's like this balance of like, how much might Matt Nagy's offense be holding Mitchell Trubisky back from being better than he is right now versus how much are they just kind of holding him together? And if they had just let him loose, is he going to be really not taking care of the ball all over the field? So I think we're seeing expectations for Trubisky shift from, is this going to become a great quarterback, to how good of a quarterback, are we in the Christian Ponder, Blake Bortles area? Are we in more the Alex Smith, Andy Dalton area? And like, how far into quarterback purgatory might the Bears be headed? And how successful can they be if Mitchell Trubisky's not going to be the reason they win every week? Because it seems like at this point, when you have guys like Kyle Allen stepping into games and throwing 4 touchdowns, and Luke Falk steps in for the Jets and completes 80% of his passes. I mean, this is the era of any quarterback seems to be able to step in and produce. And the fact that Trubisky can't, even, in his 3rd season and 2nd year in this offense, that sort of is telling you what he is in his career right now.
Can he throw left?
It's been, I don't want to say, it's not like drastically better, but he can, right? Like the problem is when you're talking like underneath, he can throw, I mean, when it's short of the sticks, under 10 yards, he can throw left, he can throw right, and it's fine. When you start talking about throwing downfield, certainly from a mechanic standpoint, it tends to get wonkier when he's throwing deep into the left, because as he's sort of stepping into his throw, he'll step his plant foot, his left foot too wide because he's going to the left rather than the right. And sometimes you'll see it wonky, but he also hasn't been phenomenal throwing downfield to the right this season either. So like, I don't know how much of it is a left versus right as it is a throwing across the field, across the numbers downfield issue. So we've seen him hit a couple of deep shots to the left and the right. And so far it's the direction is not the issue.
So if you're game planning against him, do you just rush for, let coverage do its job, or do you think you can increase some opportunities for turnovers by adding some additional pressure with the blitz? What do you think is kind of the best opportunity against him?
It depends on, I mean, like, obviously, if you can rush 4 and get a lot of pressure, of course, that's what you want to do. But the book on Trubisky for a lot of his career has been trying to throw a lot of different things at him from a looks standpoint. And it doesn't mean you're blitzing every time, but if you bring the pass rush from different spots and show him pass rush in one area and come elsewhere. I mean, this Bears offensive line has been maybe their biggest weakness this season. I mean, even as much as Trubisky has struggled, a lot of his struggles have also been offensive line related. Despite it being the same 5 offensive line starters from last year, Kyle Long has been absolutely atrocious, one of the worst guards in the NFL this season. And they had an injury at right tackle last week, and their center, James Daniels, he moved over from left guard last year, and seems to still be kind of struggling with readjusting to the center position, and he's been a disappointment. So, like, the Packers in week 1 really figured it out. They stunted like crazy and brought different pass rushers from everywhere, and this offensive line could never consistently pick it up. There were always free rushers coming through. Even the Packers had a 3-man rush where, I mean, it was a clean shot to the quarterback where they just had, overload on one side and somebody kind of came sneaking through. And I mean, it's just little things like that you can't have successful offense in the face of. So that's kind of where I would look for Minnesota. Is I know a guy like Mike Zimmer doesn't get too crazy with a ton of that, but if you're putting a couple of those A-gap looks, double A-gap linebackers, and then bring a cornerback off the edge when the A-gap linebackers drop back and loop people in and out, I think that's the best way to get in Mitchell Trubisky's head. It doesn't have to be 7 guys, but if that 5th guy is just running through and getting after Trubisky, I think that'll be effective. And then you can kind of just say, hey, Mitch, beat us with your arm. If you take a lead and force the Bears to kind of have to pass back into this game. And so far, trying to force Trubisky to beat you with the pass has been a pretty successful strategy.
Let's talk about that offensive line. I know it's always difficult, especially when it comes to offensive linemen, but just generally difficult to ask why. But I feel like every individual offensive lineman has played below what I had expected for them this year. Obviously, with Bobby Massey out with the concussion, that's not going to be as relevant at right tackle. There's just going to be a downgrade of that position just because. But do you know why everybody is playing worse? Whitehair hasn't been awful, but I feel like everybody has played worse than they did last year.
Yeah, and I think Charles Leno has been fine. I mean, I think the left guard and left tackle, generally speaking, there's always some variance there, but over the 3-game sample size, I think the Bears feel pretty good about those 2 guys. But then with Kyle Long, I don't know the why, but I do know the what. He's just mentally not seeing it. I mean, there are just plays when he's not, in the running game, he's not getting to the second level. He's just kind of stuck on his guy, or a linebacker comes into his gap and he just either doesn't see it or doesn't think it's his responsibility. When you kind of look at the structure of the play, you feel like that was Kyle Long's guy and nobody got him. And same in pass protection. Sometimes they'll stunt at him and he just isn't seeing it. And from a technique standpoint, he's just not anywhere nearly as consistent as he used to be. And I'm not sure why. He's not just old and weak. It's just his hands aren't in the right place. And sometimes he gets off balance and like I said, I know the what, I don't know the why with Kyle Long. And then Bobby Massey has been weak. Sorry, what?
Old and weak.
A little, and I don't know if you saw, but after the win in Washington, Tariq Cohen went on Instagram Live from the locker room, and a fully naked Kyle Long walks into the background, package and all for the internet to see. So it's been a long week for Kyle Long, certainly. But no, so right tackle Bobby Massey last week, just randomly Monday had vertigo and missed the game. I don't know that they ever called it a concussion. He's listed as
sorry, that's my mistake. Yeah, he had vertigo. Yeah.
And they listed as illness on the injury report this week, but he was a full participant on Wednesday, and I'm guessing he should be good to go. And Kyle Long's had a hip injury that's been on the injury report, but I don't know that has been the reason. The hip looked fine when he was totally naked in the locker room, so I don't think that's been a problem for him too. He's just, I think he's just kind of past his prime, and this will probably be his last year in the Bears starting lineup. And then James Daniels, really big disappointment. The whole talk all offseason was that, well, he's a better fit at center. It's a better spot for him, and it's very clearly not been through 3 games. And maybe he's still kind of adjusting to making the calls and having to go from the snap into his block and sort of make that step process be smooth and not just snap and then block. It's kind of got to be part of the same thing. But it's also been some mental stuff from him too. I think maybe having to make those protection calls and make sure everyone's in their place can be a lot for him to have to think about and deal with on every play. And maybe it's been too much, but they're locked in with these guys in the spots that they are now. So they're just going to have to live with the ups and downs. And I think that's a real major concern for me in this game.
Will they ever make a switch back between center and left guard?
I don't know that they would during the season. And I try and give Harry Heaston, their offensive line coach, the benefit of the doubt. I mean, for those who don't know, he was the Notre Dame offensive line coach to make, all those Notre Dame linemen, Quentin Nelson, and I'm struggling to think of all of them. Mike McGlinchey.
McGlinchey.
Yeah, I mean, he's McGlinchey. he is a proven offensive line talent developer at the college level and has coached in the NFL before, was actually the Bears offensive line coach in the Lovie Smith days when their offensive line was pretty darn good. So I have to give him some benefit of the doubt and kind of say, okay, give James Daniels some time and give Kyle Long some time, and maybe they'll start to turn it around because he knows offensive line a heck of a lot better than I do. But I don't know if, you move Cody Whitehair to left guard, if there's going to be, or you move Cody Whitehair back to center and Daniels to left guard, if that's going to have its own kind of adjustment period where things are going to struggle a bit at first. So you might as well kind of stick through what you're doing now unless stuff really hits the fan and goes off the rails. And then you might feel desperate to make a change.
Allen Robinson, Xavier Rhodes, interesting matchup. Robinson's been having a really remarkable season, I think, all things considered. How do you see that matchup playing down?
I think there's going to be opportunities for Allen Robinson, but I'm like, for example, I don't know that it's going to be another 100-yard game or anything like that. Right? I mean, Rhodes has given up some completions. It's not, he's not totally shutting down everything thrown his way. So, they're going to get Allen Robinson his quick curls. They're going to take a couple of shots downfield and put it up there for him. And if he can win some of those contested catches, then I think that would be the difference for Allen Robinson. But I don't know that, he's going to be the go-to all of your yards go through him type weapon in this game. Last week it was Taylor Gabriel that got all the touchdowns. And I think that was more just sort of right place, right time, and just kind of worked out against Washington's defense. So, they're working on kind of spreading the ball around a little bit. I'm expecting, more running backs and Tariq Cohen and David Montgomery getting the ball a little bit more in this game and trying to get some other receivers involved. But I think Robinson will get his, but I don't think it's going to be a big performance from him. I think it'll be sort of, measured, 4 or 5 catches for 40 to 60 yards, somewhere in there.
And Vikings fans will definitely complain about 5 catches for 60 yards.
Well, just a range. I think there might be a 15-yarder down the sideline that bumps everything up, but then
you got to cut Rhodes. Well, that's it.
Yeah, he's trash.
So then I expect speed versus speed. Trey Waynes, Taylor Gabriel. Gabriel, like you said, I think he has every receiving touchdown the Bears have. What are the opportunities there in that matchup?
Taylor Gabriel's role in this offense, I think, is the hardest thing to get a good sense of, or just not necessarily role in the offense, but success that he's going to have, because, like last week really kind of came out of nowhere, and it wasn't so much that they emphasized him. It was just like he was wide open twice in the end zone, so Mitchell Trubisky threw it to him, and it didn't really matter who they had lined up in that position in that play, and it wasn't specifically tailored to Taylor. But he did have one really nice touchdown down the sideline where Trubisky hit him right near the goal line downfield on the run. It was a pretty impressive throw and catch from the quarterback and wide receiver. Really the only impressive throw and catch we saw from the Bears in that game. So
yeah, really great throw, really great catch. Only opportunity for a great throw.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So with Taylor Gabriel, he's been really quiet the other 2 games and had a lot of quiet games last season. And I would kind of expect him to continue to be quiet, and I don't really have a good rhyme or reason for when he's going to randomly have those big games, because he had one or two last season, just kind of like that, where catches and yards and touchdowns just kind of come, and it's like, oh, that was the Taylor Gabriel game. So I don't think we're due for another one of those for another few weeks, so I wouldn't worry about him too much. And he has a concussion as well. He suffered last week, and it's not totally clear if he'll play.
So at running back, there's Tariq Cohen, there's Mike Davis, and newly christened starter David Montgomery, I believe, right? He's the starter now?
Yeah, actually, Mike Davis played 1 snap last week, and it was 1 carry, and that really kind of...
A big change from week 1.
Yeah, that happened really fast. I mean, week 1, they abandoned the running game as a whole, and Nagy kind of took the L on that one, literally. But then, sort of trying to get David Montgomery more and more involved, and they were concerned about putting too much on the rookie. So I think at this point they feel like they can kind of let him loose, and that's probably a little bit quicker than they anticipated. So, I mean, it'll be Montgomery getting the vast majority of the carries. They'll get Cohen back there a little bit here and there. They'll probably get Cordero Patterson, his 1 or 2, but I would expect it to be Montgomery, and he does a great job of, making guys miss and showing you a lot of that great contact balance that he did at Iowa State. But the offensive line hasn't given him a lot of room to work with. He's created a lot for himself, but you can only do so much when guys are meeting you at the line of scrimmage and in the backfield.
Yeah, I mean, he was a PFF favorite in the draft because of his ability to make people miss, but, you can't make that many people miss before people drag you down. But it seems like he's got kind of a long-term prognosis of being an above-average back, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that we're still sort of just seeing the beginning of, well, I mean, obviously it's 30 games into his rookie season, but particularly
Right.
in the passing game that, he had a nice wheel route out of the backfield in week 1. But other than that, it's been a little quiet, a couple screens here and there, a couple of checkdowns here and there. But I have a feeling as the season goes on, and as the Bears feel more comfortable asking him to do more, first they're ramping him up in the running game and making sure he's good that way. Then once they feel good in that regard, then I think we're going to see Montgomery be much, much more of a passing weapon.
All right. So final question before I let you go. I know you got to go. Tight end stuff. You've got Trey Burton. Plus, there's a whole bevy of Bears tight ends that people have wanted to work out, haven't. There was some concern about Darren Waller last week. He got over 100 yards. Some of it in garbage time, but some of it not against the Vikings. So if there is a weakness on that defense, it might be covering tight ends. Trey Burton, I feel like, has not lived up to his potential from when the Bears signed him. Is he kind of due to break out? Is it dependent on Trubisky?
Definitely somewhat dependent on Trubisky, but at this point, no one is expecting anything from Trey Burton. I mean, expectations for him have really completely fallen off. And he's been dealing with a groin injury all season. It was I think they called it a strain that happened right before week 1 that kept him out of week 1 and we're really kind of limited in the last couple of games. He's been playing some snaps, but he's not separating as a receiver, not really being able to make plays after the catch. And the second part there, plays after the catch, was not something he did a lot in Philadelphia that I think got overlooked a little bit, that even though he had nice red zone numbers and some potential for more, he was not a guy that was creating a lot of yards for himself. It was a lot of schemed plays that Trey Burton was able to take advantage of, and he hasn't quite had that in Chicago. And I think some of that is what comes back to the quarterback and the play caller having to kind of keep things a little bit simple for his quarterback. But Burton just not even necessarily running exactly as fluidly as you would like. So at this point, the tight ends in the Bears offense have really been as close to a non-factor as you can get. I mean, they're check down options who can, get you 3 to 6 yards when you need to, but nobody there has really been a threat. And even though Darren Waller went off last week, I think that says more about Darren Waller. I mean, not that the Vikings defense doesn't have some vulnerability there, but Darren Waller's a darn good tight end. And I think the Bears aren't going to be able to replicate that at this point.
Who is the best quarterback on the Bears roster?
Best quarterback?
Yeah.
It's still Mitch because, man, Chase Daniel is Chase Daniel is rough. The preseason he was just terrible, and yeah, it's still Mitch Trubisky, but they
threw Matt Nagy back there.
Matt Nagy threw some passes during training camp, and there were a couple of videos of him, and Matt Nagy might be the Bears' best quarterback.
All right, so Bears favored by 2.5 points, mostly because of that defense at home. Over under 38.5 points, so low scoring game. Thoughts? Who wins? Do they cover?
I've been going back and forth on this a little bit because I do think the Bears defense can probably keep Dalvin Cook at a reasonable production. Not that they're going to shut him down entirely, but probably not, another 150 yards or whatever he's been ripping off.
Right.
So I would expect a more tame Cook, which is then going to put Kirk Cousins in more of a position to have to throw against this Bears defense. And I do think that is a good thing for this Bears defense, and that there might be some turnovers potentially there. But then I have no faith in Chicago's offense to really put up significant points unless those turnovers become touched. If it's a pick six and a fumble recovery for a touchdown, then I think the Bears can win those games. But if it's just, a red zone interception here and a fumble recovery at midfield there, I really don't have a lot of faith in this Bears offense scoring a lot of points on this Vikings defense. So I'm expecting ugly, low scoring game, but I'm taking Minnesota in this one at this point.
All right. Glad to hear it. Thanks so much for coming on, Lorin. Appreciate it. Tell our listeners where they can find your work.
Yeah, so you can listen to me on the Locked On Bears podcast. I do some grading over at Pro Football Focus. So if you're a subscriber there, you can see my work in the premium stats, and then read about the Bears for Bears Wire.
All right, let's go to the mailbag. First question that we have is from JHS, who asks, should the Vikings get Boone more involved in the passing game given his wide receiver history, his athleticism, and the lack of wide receiver depth? Boone seems like a dangerous short passing game threat with home run potential.
That's actually a really good question, and I think that the Vikings have done just the tiniest amount of 2 running back sets where the other running back is not C.J. Ham, and I think actually that would be a pretty good idea because I think like you mentioned, Boone does have a lot of run after catch ability. He probably doesn't really have the full route tree you'd expect from like a wide receiver convert. He's not like, David Johnson from UNI, has the full wide receiver route tree at his disposal. I wouldn't say Boone does have that, but I do think that if you kind of cross-train him a little bit during the season, you could use him to kind of supplement this wide receiver depth problem the Vikings have, which isn't to say, if Diggs or Thielen do go down, that you can just put Boone out there and hope for the best. But I do think it allows you to kind of manage this problem the Vikings have at wide receiver 3 a little bit more effectively. And then it gives you the added bonus of being able to kind of motion players in and out, into the backfield, out of the backfield, do kind of the Cordero Patterson stuff, but with a threat at receiver, which is a very weird thing to say about a running back. I think it's a good idea. I still think that the Vikings are and should make Madison the primary backup. If Devin Cook goes down, Madison should be the guy that gets the bulk of the carries. I like Boone a lot, but Madison seems to just have a lot more capability as a running back. But that said, I'm not opposed to the idea of having Delvin Cook and Mike Boone out there at the same time, or Madison and Boone out there at the same time. I think that can give you wide receiver options. Out of 22 personnel, you actually have 2 wide receivers on the field instead of 1. So I hadn't actually thought of that. That's a really good idea.
Next question is from Luke Braun, who asks, will the Vikings ever pay attention to the black magic accursing their franchise and bring back the 1970s throwback unis to use against specifically the Bears?
Yeah, I think Luke brought it up on his own Twitter. I think that the Vikings were 1-6 against the Bears when they're in their alternate uniforms, at least in the past however many years. That's interesting. I didn't know that at all. That's
why does that stat exist?
I have no idea. How do you find that out?
Why
That's incredible.
Why does that stat exist? All right.
That deserves a shout out. At Luke Braun NFL, BRAUN. He does the Locked On Vikings podcast, but yeah, incredible. I mean, I love Vikings throwbacks. I think they're better than the current uniforms, and I've grown to like these uniforms. I really disliked them when they first came out. I've come to like them, and I think that the helmet change they made was really good. I think last year on TV, the helmet versus the jersey looked really bad, and now it looks a lot better. But yeah, I love the Vikings throwbacks. I think they look really good, especially the 70s style throwbacks. I've got this Alan Page jersey that's done in that style, and it just looks so good. The problem, of course, is that I think the reason the Vikings can't do a darker purple is because of the Ravens. I don't know that for sure. Don't quote me, but I think that's the issue. But I think for a throwback, you could probably do it. I mean, the Packers are wearing whatever that is in their throwbacks. So yeah, and it's not like not everybody has like the same color of deep blue and the same color of orange anyway. So it shouldn't be that much of an issue. But yeah, I think that's how you combat it, right? Especially because man, are the Bears wearing like a 1920s throwback? I mean, I
thought it was 30s.
Socks with the band. Well, that makes sense. Because the socks with the bands look so weird, and I don't want to say I hate it. I kind of like the whole thing. I know a lot of people think it looks ugly, and I get it. Like I see it, and I can see ugly, but I also kind of see like the whole thing they're going for, and I kind of dig that too. But the Vikings ones are just clean in any era. So maybe it's because the franchise isn't as if the Vikings existed in the 1930s. I'm sure those 1930s uniforms would look pretty bad.
Yeah, the Vikings 09 jerseys, I kind of want to see back
they're a
at
bit
some
darker
point
too, aren't they?
Yeah. So
yeah.
I'd be a fan of that coming back. Although if memory serves, in 09 when they went to Chicago, they had throwbacks to either the 70s or 90s for their jersey, and that's when
I think it was the 90s.
Yeah, I think they got. I know they got creamed against Chicago that particular game. So yeah. Just more reasons not to have throwbacks in
who are the 3 losses that year? It was Chicago, Cardinals, I think?
It was Cardinals, it was Chicago, and it was a really odd game.
The Cardinals was a pretty odd game too.
Well, that was a Sunday night game, and that was the game with the famous leg break flopping around in the air.
I shouldn't. That's awful. I shouldn't laugh.
Well, I mean, it certainly wasn't fun to watch. It was.
Oh, it was 4 losses. Oh, yeah, of course. So let's see. They've got that win against the Colts. They win against the Chiefs. They win against the Texans.
They won against.
Lose to the Cowboys.
They lost.
That's the preseason. That was the preseason. Okay. Yeah. I was like, that doesn't make sense.
Because
where's the 49ers win? I remember that.
Yeah, because
there was lose to the Steelers.
Yep. Oh,
lose to the Cardinals. Yeah, lose to the Panthers. I remember the Panthers won, and then lose to the Bears. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, because the last second kick against the Ravens game, I remember that, and obviously I was there for the 49ers game. So okay, yeah, let's end the Bengals the Bengals game at the very end of the season, which was hilarious to watch.
Yes.
Sorry, we'll stop having nostalgia for the 09 season.
Down memory lane.
Yeah. Eddie asks, would you participate in a fantasy league that scored entirely on the finalized PFF grades?
I did do that actually way back. The issue is that I'm not a very organized person logistically, and I was the one who was organizing the league, and I had to do it manually. And so the league lasted for like 5 weeks, and then I was like, okay, I'm just screwing all this up. I just kind of collapsed.
I have too many spreadsheets open to be able to continue to do this.
Right, yeah. So I did do that. I think it's a really fun idea. I think you can't do it off of the current 2.0 PFF thing, like with the Madden 100 thing. You have to do it off of a cumulative grade. So that's the biggest issue. But I've done it. It's fun.
Galileo asks, the Bears dominated the Rams offense last year, and their scheme is similar to the Vikings. What adjustments do the Vikings need to do to make to counter?
Yeah, I would argue that the Rams offense is not as similar as you'd expect, given that they're both wide zone style West Coast offenses. You hear that, you see, the motion sweeps, and you think they're probably the same. But the Vikings actually do have a more diverse running game than the Rams, which is not to say that it's better or worse. We've seen some teams with really incredibly diverse running games not get off the ground. We've seen, just like the Rams, have simple running games and make a lot happen for them. But it is a more diverse running game, which means it can have more answers to the kinds of things Chicago does. Obviously in the interview that you just heard with Lorin Cox, the depth at defensive tackle is going to be a bit of an issue for the Bears, and that might open up some creases for the Vikings in the running game. But I think that primarily it's just going to be the fact that I think the Vikings have higher quality receivers than the Rams do. I think that, for example, I think the way people treat Cooper Kupp, right now he's a little bit overrated. I think that Brandon Cooks is a really tremendous receiver who's a little bit underrated, but is not quite the same level of talent as Diggs or Thielen. So I think that that's going to help. I think that the way the Bears cornerbacks are playing this year, like we mentioned in the interview with Lorin, does provide some of its own opportunities. And then, like Lorin mentions, I think that the capabilities you have to attack those linebackers, I think they're more obvious this year than they were last year as weaknesses in the Bears defense. So I think that there's a couple more opportunities here, and then you don't really have to worry about kind of the schematic similarities, because I don't think those are as strong as to create those kinds of worries.
All right, Kai asked the question, does the team need Cousins to win the game with his arm, or will either the running game or the defense win the game for them if they win at all?
Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by the defense winning the game for them. Like, obviously, if the defense scores a bunch of points by itself on like pick sixes and stuff like that, and then doesn't allow any points, obviously the defense wins the game. But if we think, hey, the defense holds them to 10 points or 14 points or whatever, and then the offense squeaks by with 15, did the defense win it for them? What if the final 8 points come on a 2-minute drive at the end of the game where Kirk not only throws the scoring touchdown, but also like runs it in for 2. Does that mean the offense won the game? Because the defense still only held them to 14 points. That's kind of difficult to parse out because, how the game ends will kind of define, usually what the narrative coming out of the game is. And the fact that the Vikings weren't able to score for like 3 quarters until that final 2-minute drive is not going to be discussed as much, right? But the defense in that scenario, I would say, did more to help win the game than the offense, despite that last-minute drive. So I kind of don't know what that means. I will say that I think it is likely that the Vikings will have to rely a lot more on Kirk Cousins to win this game, even though there are some weaknesses, like we mentioned, with the injuries at defensive tackle that should allow some more lanes to open up in the running game. I don't think we can expect Alvin Cook to average 6.5 yards a carry for the rest of the year. And I think this is one of those games where that comes back down to earth a little bit. And Cousins is going to have to keep the offense on schedule, or if the offense is off schedule because of, like, say, a tackle for loss, he's going to have to dig the Vikings out of it. And because of that, I think Cousins will be more crucial to this kind of game than, say, the Raiders game, right? So where Cousins averaged like 8.3 yards per attempt, but was clearly not, the most significant figure in that game. So yeah, I think that a significant amount of the burden is going to fall back onto the quarterback. But I do think that the defense will do a lot. Like, I think if the defense allows 21 points, A, that would be a huge surprise. But B, you could say that the defense kind of let the Vikings down, because even though like the average is 24 points or something like that, and they held them below NFL average, I think the defense is expected to do better than just better than average, especially against, Mitch Trubisky. So I'll expect the defense to hold them to very few points, unless something like a pick six, a special teams touchdown, which is very possible because they've got Cordero Patterson, or a field position problem occurs. I still think that offensively you're going to rely a lot more on Kirk.
Yeah. Next question is from John Belk, who asks, seems like there's always some short side note about O'Neal is playing well at the end of discussions about how disastrous our line still is. How well is he playing exactly? Are we looking at a potential franchise left tackle or just a pleasantly decent tackle? How has he improved so far from being a pretty unheralded day 2 pick?
That's actually a really good question. So I'll say that among, like, say, right tackles, he's underrated, right? Like, he's no Lane Johnson, right? He's no Ryan Ramczyk. So among, like, right tackles, there's, like, some level of, like, lack of notoriety. People don't talk about right tackles all that much. But I'll say that he's playing at a relatively high level. So, PFF has him as like the 10th best tackle in the league. I wouldn't put him there based off of what I saw. I'll say that he is currently in the discussion to be in the top third or the top quarter, maybe somewhere around there, of right tackles. And because he's putting in above average performances at a consistent rate, which at the beginning of the season is difficult to do. So some of these really good right tackles are, getting dinged for one game where he hasn't had the bad game yet, so he's not getting dinged yet. But he is playing pretty well. And he's the best performing offensive lineman that the team has. He's being asked to do a lot more run blocking than pass blocking. We've talked about that a bunch this year. So we'll kind of see what happens when more pass blocking responsibility falls on his shoulders, because of the two areas of his game, that's the area that's not quite as strong. He's a little bit of a better run blocker than a pass blocker. But we'll see. I think he's punching above his weight, which is great. But, whether or not we can say he's more than just well above average, I don't know yet. I'll say that he's not a cornerstone, definitely lock him in there kind of guy. And, next year, if the Vikings want to move him to left tackle, I'll probably be against it, just because, it's almost just as important to be good on the right side, and I wouldn't want to screw up his footwork. And it's just worth it to invest in a left tackle.
Yeah. Next question is from Matt Nelson, who asks, what has been the difference for Kendricks this year? There was grumbling last year that he was underperforming despite splash plays, but this year he's doing great. Has something changed?
I mean, he's just making fewer mistakes, right? Because like you mentioned, last year, he made a bunch of splash plays, but then, he'd take a bad tackling angle, or he'd be, 2 steps behind in coverage on a tight end down the field, or he'd bite too much on play action and not read his keys. And he'd miss some tackles too. And right now he's actually missing a couple of tackles. Like his missed tackle rate is a little bit high, but it's fine because of all the splash plays he's making. He's not making a bunch of these other kinds of mistakes. He's following the running back to the hole and he's meeting them there. When he's making contact with the running back, he's making it much closer to the line of scrimmage than he did last year. He's a little bit more hesitant. And I remember last year, one of the things I was really confused by, and I still don't know why the case is, he was maybe the most instinctive linebacker coming out of that draft, and I thought he was a first-round worthy pick. And in fact, I wanted the Vikings to pick him, trade down, pick him in the first round, and then, pick a cornerback in the second round. And they did the opposite, but they were able to get Kendricks in the second round. I thought it was a steal. And the reason is because he was the most instinctive linebacker in the draft. So last year, when he wasn't playing fast, and by that I don't mean he was physically slow, but he was reacting to stuff slowly, I was a little bit confused. And that's not happening here. He's anticipating plays before they develop and blowing them up. So that, I think, is the biggest change, because there's still some issues with tackling form. There's some issues with strength, which has been a weakness of his. But primarily, he's doing a great job getting to where the play is before the play develops. So that, I think, is the primary change.
Also from Matt Nelson, the question is, Vikings Twitter likes to act like Zimmer is some old school curmudgeon that would prefer to run a wing T offense, never pass, and lean on his defense. He clearly understands offense considering how well he schemes to stop it. Why does he absolutely refuse to get involved with the offensive side of the ball? Why doesn't he use his defensive knowledge to help improve the offense?
I would say that he does. I think that he sits in on game planning meetings for the offense, and he talks about, kind of what principles might work and what might not work. But he doesn't spend time studying opposing defenses, so his input in that capacity does get limited. There's only so much time he has, and he wants to spend it studying other team offenses to blow them up. And I think there's something about the type of thinking it takes to disrupt versus the type of thinking it takes to create. And he's a disruptor, right? I mean, that's what defenders do, right? Is that they disrupt the kind of offensive play designs. And so seeking out weaknesses versus building strengths, it's just like its own type of thinking. So it's not really the same style of thinking, but he does sit in on offensive game plans and he does provide input. What's interesting is that, a lot of people talk about how much he likes to run the ball, which is kind of fair given how he treated DiFilippo when DiFilippo was here as the offensive coordinator. But, I mean, his defenses have always been better at stopping the pass than they have been at stopping the run. And, of course, after games, he's like, we got to stop the run better. But he never sacrificed his ability to stop the pass in order to stop the run. And he was much more aggressive about moving to nickel when defenses needed to move to nickel. So, it's very clear from a defensive perspective, he understands that passing does kind of move the league. So this idea that he's just married to the run offensively is interesting. I'm not saying it's unfair, but it's interesting given what his defensive priorities have been. And maybe it's just this cognitive dissonance thing, kind of like how coaches hate it when they're on defense and the other team decides to go for it on 4th and 1. But then when they've got an opportunity to go for it on 4th and 1 in the same situation, in the same, field position, they don't do it. Right. And it's very interesting because if they just thought of it like, well, if the other team did this, which one would scare me more? They might change their decision making. So it might be related to that, right? Where he hates allowing completed passes or allowing teams to pass easily without harassment and is willing to give up the run. But on the other side of the ball, he kind of preferred to run it. Maybe that's the case, but it strikes me as odd that he would sell out this much for an offense that runs the ball more. I think really we are just a little bit too bought into these two games where the Vikings have been up 21-0. They passed the ball more than they ran in the Atlanta Falcons game before the score went up to 21-0, but a lot of those passes were called back because of penalty. And so it looks like a mismatch, but they still ended up passing the ball a little bit more than you'd expect, given the final rundown of runs to passes. So, he's fine throwing the ball. in standard down situations, the Vikings are going to run the ball more than a typical team does, but they're still going to pass it more by the end of the year than they're going to run it. At least that's what I think. So I don't think it's so old school that he's curmudgeonly and all that. I do think he gets involved in offensive meetings, but I do think he spends his resources into the type of thinking that he's comfortable with. So that's kind of my long-winded half answer to the direct question you asked.
Brian Jellerson asks, do you think the NFLPA will bite on the 17-game season, or is this more of a bargaining chip? Also, would you guys prefer a 17-game season or an 18 weeks with 2 byes?
So this was reported by The Athletic that the NFL didn't want to pursue an 18-game option. Some owners were opposed to it after it had been proposed. They didn't like the idea that players would be able to bargain 16-game minimum or maximum for players. And that 16-game maximum would have meant that fans would have bought tickets to games where they expected to see stars, and then the stars would be sitting because it's one of their 2 designated games to sit. So they didn't like that idea, which I get. Like, I think that strategically it's kind of a cool idea that you have to figure out, who sits when, whether or not you're just going to give up the first 2 games by playing your backups, or if you're going to use kind of strategic, development time or whatever. But I understand, like, from a business perspective, that doesn't make a ton of sense. I don't think the NFL can really push for that 17-game season. I just think that they wouldn't be able to hold the 18-game season as a negotiating stance when so many of the owners were against it. So they're kind of moving to 17. I don't think it's going to be that serious. I don't think the NFLPA will bite on that. Their push right now is, salary, higher salary percentage, and player safety. And if that kind of hurts the player safety side of things. So I don't think it's going to be the case. And then what I personally prefer, I kind of think there should be 2 bye weeks anyway, but an 18-game season with 2 bye weeks would be fun if there were better provisions to kind of protect players who now by the end of the season, the Super Bowl champions will have played like 22 games instead of like 19 or whatever. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't think it's a serious proposal that they'll be able to fully advance.
No, and when you had mentioned the things that the NFL is trying to push right now, including player safety, it does just fly in the face of. And but when's the last time that the NFL was truly making decisions that were following their own directives on that sort of thing? So,
no, I think it's what the NFLPA will put the kibosh on it, because they actually care about player safety a little bit.
They're paid to anyway. The NFL, however, is not. Matt Myrick had a question that was more relevant before the Packers lost. It was, who would have thought this could have been a contest to determine the sole possession of last place, talking about the Bears and the Vikings. Have both of these teams taken a significant step back from last year, or have the Packers just improved? Or have the Packers, or is the Packers' run defense just the worst run defense in the league? That was my addition, not Matt's.
Yeah, so assuming that the Packers won, is this a case where both teams have dropped off? And I don't think so, right? Because I think the Vikings have looked good in 11 of 12 quarters. The Bears, I think, were just overrated. We talked about this before the season, that we thought that the Bears were overrated. And now we're sort of seeing the fruits of that. Of course, the reason the Bears are in a position to, quote-unquote, be in last place is because they lost to an in-division team, the Packers. So I would say there's nothing to be said here about last place in the NFC North that'll tell us very much, because there have been so many in-division games. The only team with an out-of-division loss right now is the Packers, which is kind of weird because they're the only ones with in-division wins. But yeah, I wouldn't say that either team has shown significant signs of regression. Now, the Bears' offense has tailed off because Trubisky is just not that talented. The defense, we'll see. They were not very good at generating turnovers in the first 2 games, but they were playing a very turnover-averse offense with the Packers. And then obviously in the 3rd game, they played a very turnover-friendly offense with Case Keenum at quarterback and generated 5 turnovers. So they're back to where it feels like they were at the end of last year. So who knows, right? I'll say that I think that their turnover production will continue to not sustain itself, which will lead to a little bit of a drop-off, but that defense still seems to be performing a lot better than we expected. So I'd say that there's not really a significant drop-off among the teams in the NFC North. And the Lions have played a little bit better than we expected to.
They have, but they still also do the whole Lions thing and end up tying the Arizona Cardinals for some reason.
Cardinals? What?
Yeah. Kyle Slaby asks, Arif, would you rather Wentz look awful and the Packers win, or Trubisky looks good, especially passes to the left, and the Vikings lose?
I don't. So that's like a but, right? So Wentz looks awful, but Trubisky looks good, right? Like Kyle, I don't understand your question. My preference is that my takes are correct, and
that the brand is strong.
Right, that the brand remains strong. Trubisky looking awful on passes to the left, I think, is currently more important to my brand than Carson Wentz looking bad. So I'm going to go with Trubisky looking bad. And in that case, I guess the Vikings win, right? And then the Packers lose and Wentz looks good, which it looks like I might not have to choose because I don't think Wentz looked particularly great. Although, like, statistically, like 3 touchdowns, right? So that looks all right. But in the game, he didn't look all that great. So
no, Wentz takes are the old and busted, and the Trubisky takes are the new hotness. So you can just go that route and call it good. I'm just going to age myself with a reference that's almost 20 years old.
That is. Wow.
Yeah. Also, what is more likely? The Vikings gain more yards rushing than passing, or Trubisky by himself rushes for more yards than he passes?
That's really funny. I don't think the Vikings will get more rushing yards than passing yards again. So, but I do think it is very possible, especially with the way Mike Zimmer talked about Trubisky. I do think it's very possible that that Trubisky ends up with more rushing yards than passing, and that could be like a double-edged sword, right? Because he could go off for like 140 on the ground and then 130 in the air, and that'll be enough. Very like Josh Allen versus the Vikings type stat line. That is pretty unlikely, though. Yeah, let's go with the first one's more likely, even though it just feels like the second one has it. The first one's more likely.
Raul asks, coin toss question, what is the evidence for deferring possession until the second half? Does this strategy work against the Vikings' strengths? The Vikings give up points early and adjust well as the game goes on. Early deficits limit a run-first philosophy on defense.
So I'll say that the evidence exists, but is extremely scant, that the double possession is an actual advantage. It's a very theoretical advantage, but you can't guarantee the double possession, right? Because they could just have the ball at the end and run out the clock, and now you don't get the double possession. Whereas you can guarantee the first possession. So the double possession really only exists because they have the first possession. So you're always catching up to their possession until the very end. And so having the double possession just means you've caught up. So I actually don't like it. I understand why it exists. It's intuitively comforting to have the ability to double dip. But if you're a drive behind, you may just need to double dip to catch up. So I don't think it's that much of an advantage. And I'll also say I don't think playing ahead is as much of an advantage for the Vikings as it seems to be, because I don't think the Vikings go up 7-0 and then automatically just start running the ball a lot. I think that they see that as a standard down situation where, 7 points isn't enough to start changing your strategy. And the Vikings are more likely to change their strategy to run the ball in a lot of situations than other teams, but I just don't think 7 points is enough to do that early in the game. So I'll say I do think that for the Vikings, as it's constructed, it is suboptimal, but it's so small a disadvantage or advantage that it's not worth picking too many nits about. I do think that your intuition is correct, that it's probably better for the Vikings to receive, to give them more opportunities to score first than it is to double dip, because double dipping only gets you back to even. But I just don't think that the advantage is so significant, because by the end of the game, it's usually 13-14 or 14-14 in terms of total number of drives. And so, your ability to generate a 3 and out on a particular drive is going to be massively more important than whether or not you defer, which is why it's a coin flip, right? Because it's just not that significant. It's not like, apparently in cricket, the coin flip is like huge, but football. It's not that big.
And cricket games, depending on what the game is, can last 2 weeks. So
right, yeah,
that's a whole other gigantic problem. Joe Justice asks, in honor of this week's news, what can I make with peaches and mint? I was thinking ice cream or Moscow mules. Any suggestions?
Man, if only Dusty was available for this episode.
I know.
You have some suggestions.
I do, actually. I grill fruit every once in a while and confuse the kids. And
grilled fruit is great, by the way.
It is. Grilled fruit is awesome, and it's worth it to take a look at their face and be like, this is really... it does turn into the Simpsons thing with the flaming Homer of, I don't know what it was, but fire made it good. So what I would suggest doing is something I've actually done is taking 3/4 a cup of sugar and 3/4 of a cup of fresh mint leaves. You can use they already picked stuff, but fresh mint leaves, and put that into a food processor or blender or something, and just chop it up nice and fine. And then you take 6 peaches and you put a little bit of like a neutral oil, like an extra virgin olive oil or just something light on it, just to coat it. And make sure to coat your grill also with a little bit of nonstick, because peaches are going to try to stick. And before you put the peaches on, go ahead and put the you don't. You just put the peaches on by themselves, and then after you take them off, you can put the sugar and mint on there. And if you really want to be crazy, you can put a little bit of cinnamon on there as well. And the cinnamon ends up just popping it really well. So I would suggest doing that, and you can actually do that on the ice cream itself. So if you wanted
we'll share some recipes in the show notes. I'm kind of preferable to do basically what you suggested. And put it on top of ice cream, but instead of just putting the mint directly on top of ice cream. So still grill the peaches, put that on vanilla ice cream, leave the mint inside some bourbon, and then pour a little bit of that into a bowl with some brown sugar and heat that up, and reduce it, and then pour that on top of the ice cream.
Really, just make a simple syrup and then set up an IV and then just slowly let that seep directly into your veins. Dusty would appreciate that answer. Don from Ohio asks, between Arif, Dusty, and James, which one would be the whistleblower of the other two if they were stealing company funds?
Well, Dusty has the most capability to steal company funds.
Not necessarily. Well, I'm the one in charge of everything, so
Well, whose account who has the PayPal? It's like in Dusty's name, right?
It has Dusty's name on it, which is still which was annoying when Dusty wasn't on the show. I'm trying to give money to the show, but it keeps saying Dusty. Is it still going to you guys? Yes.
We had that question.
It's a gigantic pain to change the name on a PayPal account, as it turns out, knowing that firsthand. So, no, it's handled by me. So,
I'm glad you've admitted to being in the best position to embezzle money in case that happens. So, yeah, I guess I'm the whistleblower.
I think Dusty's got his name on everything. I don't have my name on it, so it's not like...
Dusty's the fall guy. Yeah. You're the embezzler. Right. I'm the whistleblower.
I'm the one who
can't wait for my side-eye feature in the New York Times.
Side note.
Somebody who writes for The Athletic popped open the operation. It's like, who could you be talking about?
Yeah, you'll have your top half of the newspaper all set and ready to go, like Ted Glover's grandkids today. Fantastic. All right, well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We will be back next week to talk about, hopefully, the victory over the Chicago Bears. So look forward to that. Again, if you donate to the show in the amount of tree fitty or more via Patreon, you will be receiving swag from us. So go ahead and do that if you hear value in what we produce. Also, we will be doing the live show on November 29th at Pedosky's in Seattle, Washington. So, Arif, what do you have to plug?
All right, so I've already got a piece up at The Athletic about, takeaways from the Vikings-Raiders game, which I plugged in the last show. That's still up there. By the time this goes live for most of you, unless you just get it automatically the night of, I'll probably have a piece up at The Athletic about how to attack that Bears defense if indeed there's weaknesses to be exploited. So check that out.
All right, that is going to be it for this episode. So for Arif, for Dusty, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember that revenge is a dish served best. I'm just going to mess that up too. I'm not even going to cut that. We're just going to keep going. Revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.